What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we are going to be ranking the albums of the modern metal titans, Revocation. I've been listening to Revocation since around 2010, and it's been really interesting to watch them shift styles throughout their career while continuing to get bigger and bigger. Despite the fact that Revocation seemed like a newer name, they actually got their start way back in the year 2000 under the name Cryptic Warning. They would release one album under that name before changing their name to Revocation in 2006 and independently releasing their debut album Empire of the Obscene in 2008. Empire of the Obscene definitely tracks closely with the trends of the late 2000s. It's got a very prominent melodic death metal influence, a very prominent tech death influence, but I think what sets it apart from those albums are two things. One, the thrash influence here is very pronounced, and then two, the instrumental prowess of vocalist, guitarist, and primary songwriter David Davidson just really sets this album apart. David is a graduate of the Berklee College of Music in Boston, and as any Revocation fan knows, his guitar playing is absolutely incredible. David was even ranked the best modern metal guitarist in 2011 by Metal Sucks, and while I don't agree with everything Metal Sucks posts, to say the least, I do agree that he is an absolutely fantastic guitarist, and I think you really hear that on this album in particular, because Empire of the Obscene, to me, is just an absolute guitar tour de force. The solos on this album are absolutely amazing. They're acrobatic and just incredible in some of the phrasing that David uses. In terms of riffing, David is obviously no slouch either. The song Exhumed Identity in particular is just a medley of amazing melodic riffs. From front to back, there is so much energy and so many great ideas in that song. I also really love the song None Shall Be Spared, All Shall Be Speared, both for its title and for that melodic groove that kind of carries it along. Stylistically, a lot of the band's signature elements were already here. You already have Dave's kind of vomited, raspy vocals, as well as even some clean vocals in the track Iniquity, which would become more prominent later in Revocation's career. The band also sound incredibly tight here. In addition to David, you have Anthony Buddha on bass and backing vocals on this album, as well as Phil DuBois Coyne on drums. Those two individuals apparently had been jamming with David since 8th grade, so it makes sense that they would be such a tight instrumental unit, and I think we can really hear on this album how comfortable they are playing together. I will say not everybody seems to enjoy this album. It's the band's lowest rated album on Metal Archives. It's also very long. At 55 minutes, it's the band's longest album, and it definitely does drag a bit. I would actually say that's kind of a consistent problem I have with Revocation across almost all of their albums, is that they're so good at writing music, and writing music seems to come so easy for them that sometimes they don't seem to know what to leave on the cutting room floor. On this album in particular, I think the title track and the song Fields of Predation are both songs that I think could have been left out, and it would have made the album stronger overall. That said, though, I think this is an amazing start to the band's career. It's clear they had incredible talent right from the start, and I would say this album actually has some of their best riffs and solos on it overall. They would get heavier as their career progressed, and they would start to emphasize more of the death metal elements of their sound, but I actually like the melodic tech thrash style that is on this album and would be on some of their later albums, because I think that to me is just Revocation at their best. This is not my favorite Revocation album, but it is very good and definitely one that has a lot of standout ideas, so I will put it in the middle of their discography for now, and I feel pretty good about that. Alright, so following Empire of the Obscene, Revocation would sign to Relapse Records and release their sophomore album, Existence is Futile, in 2009. This retains that melodic death thrash tech style from the debut, but I think the big difference with this album is that it just tightens things up a bit. This has the same number of songs as the debut, but a runtime that's 7 minutes shorter, so you definitely get less bloat because of that, and in addition to that, you also have more memorable songs here. The track Pestilence Reigns, which is the first proper track on the album, is just an absolute crusher. I would say it's one of the band's best straightforward thrash songs. There's loads of great riffs here, culminating in kind of this playful, jazzy solo that I love. Across Forests and Fjords is an amazing instrumental track with some really triumphant riffs. I would say probably the band's best instrumental song. The second half of this album is absolutely stacked. Dismantle the Dictator has some insane technical riffing on it. Leviathan Awaits, some really heavy and engaging riffs. And then the closing track, The Tragedy of Modern Ages, is one of my favorite Revocation songs. I love the clever little riffs in the verses, and then that epic extended outro just really ties the song and the album together for me. I would say with those high points, this is definitely the band's most well-rounded album. It's got a strong start, it's got a strong finish, and some standout tracks in between, but it's still not a perfect album to me. Like pretty much all their albums, there's a couple spots in the middle that just kind of feel like dead space and don't really do a whole lot. The title track in particular doesn't do much for me. The Brain Scramblers is another song that's kind of just in one ear and out the other. It's not bad, but it's not great. That all being said, I think in terms of front to back listens, this is the best Revocation album and has yet to be topped. So I will put it at the top. Alright, so following Existence is Futile, the band would add a second guitarist, Dan Gargiulo. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. Dan's probably most well known for his work in Artificial Brain. With Dan on board, they would release their third album, Chaos of Forms, in 2011. In terms of this album overall, stylistically, I think you could kind of tell that Revocation realized with Existence is Futile that they were kind of becoming modern metal juggernauts, if you will. And with Chaos of Forms, it seems like they decided to embrace that by writing even more accessible and catchy material. There's a lot more clean singing on this album, particularly in the songs Cradle Robber and No Funeral, which are both just fantastic tracks with some of the band's catchiest riffs. I particularly love the clean chorus of No Funeral, which just has me shouting along every time. There's also more off-the-wall moments on this album. You have gang shouts in the song Harlot, and then you have organ and trumpet in the song The Watchers, which just feels very strange. But in addition to those clean vocals and those more off-the-wall moments, you also just have solid Revocation songs. The opening track, Cretin, is really amazing. It kicks things off with a lot of energy, and it's really wild and catchy riffs. Dethroned almost has some emotional riffs, which is kind of neat. And then the track Beloved Horrifier is really awesome. It's got a really catchy melodic riff and then a really catchy chorus as well. It makes for a great track. The drumming here also feels more impressive to me. There's a lot of blast beats. And overall, this album is just really zany and energetic. It's a fun listen that I enjoy, but like the last album, it still has some dead spots. The instrumental track, Fractal Entity, for example, just sounds like something that should have been left in the rehearsal room. The title track also doesn't do much for me, which actually seems to be a trend now that I think about it. And the closing track, Reprogrammed, really isn't anything special either. Because of where those weaker moments lie on this album to me just feels a little bit less well-rounded than Existence is Futile did. And honestly, because of that, I didn't really like this album that much when it first came out. But that being said, on re-listen, I actually do enjoy it a lot. Those critiques I have of it definitely still stand, but I think it's a great album. Certainly on par with Empire of the Obscene, and I would say actually a little better. I will rank it slightly higher than Empire. It definitely has more standout tracks than Empire, but there definitely are a few albums, in addition to Existence is Futile, that I think are better than Chaos of Forms. So I won't be ranking this release, but following Chaos of Forms, it's worth mentioning the band released an EP, Teratogenesis, in 2012. This is a fantastic and really catchy EP that I would say kind of capitalizes on some of the better moments from the band's early albums. It's also the first recording to feature bassist Brett Bamberger, who replaced Anthony Buddha after Chaos of Forms was recorded. Following Teratogenesis, Revocation would release their self-titled album in 2013. With Chaos of Forms, I kind of assumed Revocation would continue going in a bit more of an accessible direction, but they really didn't. As Revocation does, they subverted expectations, and with this album, they decided to go heavier as opposed to catchier. There's a much more pronounced death and black metal influence on this album, no clean vocals whatsoever, and overall, though, I don't think that shift necessarily worked. I think I really enjoyed the band's early material because of how playful and fun it was, and to me, the self-titled album just lacks that spark. I certainly like heavier music, don't get me wrong, but for some reason, when Revocation do it on this album, it just seems to lack any sense of darkness and mystery. It's almost like the band are playing heavier just to prove they can, or just to prove to their listeners they can. But I would rather just hear them do what they do best. In addition to that, I just think a lot of the songs are weaker on this album. Scattering the Flock is the second track, and it's got a pronounced black metal influence, but it's kind of a snoozer. Entombed by Wealth is another song I don't really like that much. And then the closing track, A Visitation, has kind of some neat effects going on in the chorus, but overall is probably one of their least impressive closers, if not their least impressive closer. This album isn't a total loss. There are some good cuts here. I like the opening track, The Hive, which is one of the band's trademark thrashy openers, but it's got a particularly brutal chorus with some squealing notes in it. Archfiend has some cool ideas, but the real standout of this album to me is the track Invidious. That has banjo incorporated within it, some really catchy riffs, parts where the guitars drop out but the drums keep pounding forward, which makes for a really catchy effect, and it has clean vocals, which is something none of the other tracks on this album have. It's the most fun song here, and if every song was like it, I probably would enjoy this album more, but overall, this album is just kind of bland to me. It's not bad. It's certainly not a bad metal record, but definitely my least favorite Revocation album. So following the self-titled album, Revocation would sign to Metal Blade Records and release their fifth album, Deathless, in 2014. To me, with Deathless, they really righted the course. Compared to the self-titled album, this one is more fun, it's got more variety, and the clean vocals have returned, which I really like and I think makes for a more dynamic listen. The track Labyrinth of Eyes, I think, uses those clean vocals to really good effect, and I also love some of the bouncy riffs in this song. It almost gives me like Mastodon vibes, which is pretty cool. The title track is another track that uses clean vocals to great effect. I love the clean vocals in that chorus, it's very catchy, and it also has some thick tremolos going on that kind of retain the heaviness of the previous album. Other tracks also have that same heaviness, particularly the song Madness Opus, which has a really slow and commanding pace. It almost feels like Morbid Angel's Gateways to Annihilation, but with some techie flourishes to it. It does drag a little bit, but it's still a pretty neat track. Scorched Earth Policy kind of stands as a counterpoint to that track. It's a really furious melodic thrasher with an awesome chorus where David just goes, "All the fail-safes have failed." Oh, yeah, it's a great track. I almost think of Deathless as kind of the companion album to Existence is Futile because they're both so well-rounded and so consistent. And like Existence is Futile, the closing track on Deathless is absolutely amazing. Witch Trials is probably my favorite Revocation song. I love that main gyrating riff, and then in the final 90 seconds, that melody they play while they solo over it is just absolutely fantastic. That is just Revocation at their best to me. Unfortunately, like all their albums, this definitely has some dead spots. The Fix and The Blackest Reaches are both tracks in the second half that aren't very interesting to me. I think if you left those tracks out, you'd have an album that was, instead of 48 minutes, around 40 minutes. So it'd be a shorter and punchier listen and overall more enjoyable. Still, though, this is definitely far from a bad album. In fact, I would call it a banger. It's very close to Existence is Futile and one of their best. Alright, so following Deathless, Revocation would release their sixth album in 2016 entitled Great Is Our Sin. They got a new drummer for this album, Ash Pearson, who's probably best known for his work with 3 Inches of Blood. This, to me, is a really interesting album. I'm not sure what spurred the sonic change, but this album is a lot slower and more progressive than their other material. I think you hear that especially on the track Monolithic Ignorance, which has these riffs that just kind of tumble forward, and then a clean vocal chorus that has some like monotone and deep clean vocals. It's quite an interesting effect. It's a neat song, but I don't think that can be said for everything here. You know, with this album overall, it just kind of lacks energy to me. The second track, Theater of Horror, is kind of just a shrug-worthy mid-paced song. Then you have the song Crumbling Imperium, which has some great bass work, definitely, and some neat ideas, but it would probably be near the bottom if I were to rank all of Revocation's songs. And while I don't love the plodding tempos on this album, I don't think that's the only issue. Even the fastest song here, Communion, which is apparently the fastest song in the band's catalog, is really just not that interesting to me whatsoever, and I don't understand the hype behind this song. With that all being said, I don't think this was their worst album, however. Arbiters of the Apocalypse is a great opener. It's got some really lively and interesting riffs, and a lot of clean vocals, and a lot of catchy clean vocals at that. The final 3 songs on this album are also a really strong set of closing tracks. Copernican Heresy has some cool use of clean picking in kind of a thrashier framework. Only the Spineless Survive has some really menacing chugs to it. And then the closing track, Cleaving Giants of Ice, has some really neat reflective guitar melodies and clean singing going on. It's a pretty cool closing track. Overall, Great Is Our Sin is definitely far from my favorite. I have my complaints, but I can't say it's a bad album overall, even if it isn't my favorite Revocation album. It is still really good. All right, so that brings us to the band's 7th album, The Outer Ones, which came out in 2018. This was probably one of the biggest stylistic shifts the band had ever pulled off. With this album, they abandoned the clean vocals and embraced a heavier sound. But unlike with the self-titled album where they embraced a heavier sound and it didn't really feel very interesting, here the sound just feels very dark and atmospheric and at times almost threatening and mysterious. Members of Revocation have talked about how they are fans and are influenced by Deathspell Omega and Gorguts, and I think you really hear that on this album, particularly on the title track, which has some really menacing Gorguts vibes going on, and then a really cool Meshuggah style riff that closes it out. That Which Consumes All Things is another standout track to me. It kind of pulls forward the more progressive elements from the previous album, but it feels like it has a lot more energy to it, and I love that big lurching riff that closes it out. Blood Atonement, which was actually written by Dan and not Dave, is an awesome track. It's got this really spacey guitar melody and some really maniacal vocals in its second half. Amidst the weirdness and atmosphere, though, you still have good, straightforward cuts, like the opening track of Unworldly Origin, which is just a pounding thrash track with a really bouncy midsection that I really like. Overall, something about the songs on this album just feel a lot more interesting to me. It feels like there's more depth here and there's more to unpack. There definitely are some issues with this album, however. It kind of drags at the end. I don't really like the second to last track, Luciferous, very much. And then following that track, the closing track, A Starless Darkness, has a couple minutes where it's kind of just a doomy and plodding pace. So that segment of A Starless Darkness combined with the track Luciferous makes for a pretty uninteresting passage of music late in the album, but I will say A Starless Darkness turns it around with this blood incantation style lead and then a faster pace that picks up later in the track. Interestingly, this album seemed to get mixed reception upon its release. It sold really well. Apparently it was the first album of Revocations to break the Billboard 100, but there also were a few mediocre reviews of this album. I was also pretty mixed on this album on its release, but I have to say on re-listen, I think it's not only one of the most different, but also just one of the strongest albums in their discography. And I love the fact that even in the face of some of that mixed reception, the band still stuck to their guns. They did a tour where they played this entire album in full, and I like it when a band stands by their material like that. I don't think it's quite as memorable as Deathless, so I will rank it just slightly lower than that, but yeah, to me, this is a standout Revocation album and definitely one of their best. Alright, so following the Outer Ones, Revocation would release their latest album, Nether Heaven, which came out in 2022, earlier this year. Before this album was recorded, Dan left the band to focus on other projects, leaving Revocation as they started as a power trio. And with his absence, I think Dave pulled the band a little bit back more towards Revocation's core sound. Compared to the Outer Ones, this one's a little bit less atmospheric, but more thrashy, but also more technical. But it still veers a little bit more towards the heavy side than the fun side, which, as I said earlier, I kind of prefer the more fun side of Revocation. That being said, it still definitely has some great songs on it. Diabolical Majesty is a cool, thrashy opener with lots of fast tremolos to it. Nihilistic Violence is a cool song, too. I also like Galleries of Morbid Artistry, which has some really blunt and elegant riffs, kind of mixed together, but done really well. Strange and Eternal is a really cool song, too. It gives me really strong melodic death metal vibes, but infused with Revocation's technical flourishes, and it makes for a really cool cut. At 45 minutes long, this is Revocation's shortest and most relentless album. You don't really have a slower or more epic track here like you do on the previous albums, and even the instrumental track, The Ninth Chasm, is not even 4 minutes in length. Unlike their other albums, which typically have a more epic closer, this album closes with the track Re-Crucified, which is a fast, thrashy track. It's got some cool guest vocal spots from George Corpsegrinder Fisher of Cannibal Corpse and the late Trevor Strnad, who was obviously the vocalist for the Black Dahlia Murder. It seems like some people really like this album and see it as a return to form after the Outer Ones, but for me, I'm a little more mixed on it. It feels kind of one-dimensional to me, and while it gives you a good dimension to be in, I think the past Revocation albums just felt like they had a little bit more to offer in terms of differences between the songs. It's interesting because this album does have variety, but sometimes it feels just like a bunch of really cool tracks slapped together, as opposed to the previous albums, which felt like a little bit more of a journey, especially the outer ones, which just felt very cinematic in scope. Despite the energy on this album too, to me the songs just aren't as direct and catchy, especially when compared to some of the band's earlier tracks like No Funeral. I would love if Revocation today wrote a single like that, but instead it just seems like they're giving us a lot of really technical and a lot of really fast stuff, but not necessarily a lot of stuff that grabs me on first listen. However, due to this album's shortness, I think it has less dead space than any other Revocation album. I think it's the most consistently good. I think it just doesn't have the same highs as the previous albums, at least for me. It definitely might grow on me with time, but for now, I would rank it pretty much on par with Empire of the Obscene and slightly better with Great As Our Sin. Again, not a bad album, just not one that really blew me away or engaged me as much as some of their previous albums. Like some of the other tier lists I've done, Revocation is just a tough band to rate. They're a really consistent band, but I have to say, I don't think they've ever really released an album that's realized their full potential. I would love it if they just made a fun, thrashy, melodic album that had a lot of catchy moments along with their progressive and epic ideas and kept it to a shorter runtime, maybe 35 or 40 minutes instead of 48 minutes. If they released an album like that, I think it would be a masterpiece. It'll also be interesting to see where the band go next because as their career has shown, you never know what the next Revocation album is going to sound like. But that'll do it for this video, guys. If you like this video, please subscribe, please drop me a like, and let me know in the comments what you think of Revocation. Let me know what you think of my opinions, and if you like this video, check out this video over here where I rank the albums of the band Goat Whore. But that'll do it for this one, guys. I will see you next time. Stay heavy.